With all this talk of the trade talks and the trade war and Mark Carney pausing and halting the trade negotiations, well, now Alberta is even further on the map because there's this talk of halting oil production or halting oil going to the US. So let's get into Alberta politics.
Discuss federal politics. He only concerns himself with Alberta's independence.
And let's start with this. Rebel News is saying, Canadian Prime Minister saying, quote, the U.S.'s narrow merchandise trade deficit only exists because the U.S. buys so much of its energy from Canada. I don't think they want us to stop sending any of that energy.
Well, and I think these are empty threats, and what he's applying here would basically cut off Canada's nose to spite their face. This whole section has a ton of stories, and it all kind of relates to Alberta's oil. I mean, I'm shocked that the Canadian federal government thinks they control Alberta energy sector. And I think on October 19th, Alberta's going to say, nay, we control it. We want independence. We want to be a free and independent nation.
Another prominent justification for U.S. tariffs has been their claim that since the United States runs, quote, a trade deficit with Canada, we were ripping them off. Also a quote. But the U.S.'s narrow merchandise trade deficit only exists because the U.S. buys so much of its energy from Canada. Canada fuels American growth, supplying 99% of their natural gas imports, 85% of their electricity imports, 60% of their crude oil imports. I don't think they want us to stop sending any of that energy.
And we have another clip later on where he's going to be bragging in a bar, talking about a similar situation, which are just absolute lies. Now, Canada has had a failure to launch here. They tried to diversify their economy, and he went around the world and he wasn't able to do that because what other economies want from Canada is access to the U.S. market. America, on the other hand, has begun to diversify their energy sector with the exact same kind of oil Canada provides through Venezuela. And if Canada wanted to turn off the oil taps or the natural gas taps, America would just lower some of the restrictions on Russia, open up that oil resource, or make a deal directly with the Iranians for the Strait of Hormuz, which again would be more oil. America has the ability to diversify their trading partners, not just with their friends, but also with their enemies, because they're working with so much money and such a large market.
And yet for Canada, the U.S. is imperative and essentially its biggest and almost only customer. Even if you think about the fact that Canada is pretty much as close to the U.S. as anybody can be, but as far from anybody else that actually wants anything from Canada as can be. And yet we have premiers like Doug Ford saying even more stupid things like this. From Rebel News says, quote, Premier Ford tells Trump to kiss my behind. After Prime Minister Carney walked away from a trade agreement, the Ontario leader then demands Alberta and Saskatchewan charge more for energy exports to the U.S., calling Trump an arrogant, cocky, and a bully.
Well, and this is absolutely insane. And there's rumors that he's going to have a phone call with Danielle Smith talking about how are they going to leverage Alberta's natural resources. Danielle Smith has made it fairly clear she doesn't want a trade war. She wants zero trade. She wants zero tariffs on the United States if possible. A lot of what the United States is doing right now is affecting Ottawa, not Alberta. Why don't you have Ottawa use their leverage?
Exactly. But let's listen.
Well, he can kiss my ass as far as I'm concerned. We're going to go at him full steam. And we buy 400% more cars than anyone in the world. Maybe I have an idea. We'll get Danielle Smith on board so the cars that they're manufacturing won't be able to fill up because we'll be controlling the oil and the gas going down there. And maybe what we should be doing is charging him triple on the oil, triple on the potash, on the uranium, on our metals and our rare earth metals. That's what we need to do. We need to throw everything in the kitchen sink at him. He's arrogant, he's cocky, and, as Ronald Reagan said, if you come to a draw with a bully, what stops that bully from coming after you the next day and the next day? And that's all Donald Trump is a bully. Well, he's going to have a rude awakening. I'm going to throw everything in the kitchen sink. Like I said, he might as well call up the Energizer Bunny because he should be powering his facilities. Isn't this amazing, Bill? How we send them power, the power manufacturing facilities, to go against our country. That's like America sending Iran the weapons. It's ridiculous.
And all this tough talk is going to do nothing for Doug Ford. They want to talk like this. The Americans have 10 times the leverage. They're like a gnat on their shoulder. No puns intended, Nat, but...
like a little chihuahua barking at a big dog, and we've already shown that meme before during our show, but it's insane that they think that they have this much leverage over a country that can diversify and has already started to differently than Canada has not.
But
Canada has stalled.
I kind of started out this segment with Mark Carney's threats about oil, natural gas, and the energy sector, which we all know lies in Alberta. And then we have Doug Ford there. And there's been multiple other premiers. Those are just the biggest two. That's why I use them as the example. But let's keep going here, because if Canada actually does this, and this is their long-term plan, it's going to mean devastation, not only for all of Canada, but for Alberta as well. Alberta normally wouldn't turn off the oil taps, but because all those pipelines go through other provinces, it could be a huge impact on the Alberta economy if the federal government starts weighing in.
And as Keith Wilson says, it's Alberta's oil, not Canada's oil, and that has already been signed, but apparently we completely forgot about that. However, IQ 589 says, quote, picture of how Canada gets oil from Alberta to Ontario and Quebec. Canadians are talking about, quote, cutting off the U.S. from Canadian petroleum and natural gas. What they will end up doing is cutting Canada off from Alberta's petroleum and natural gas.
Absolutely. Now, the problem here is if that Alberta pipeline went directly into the United States, the federal government have very little say on it. But if they declare the Emergencies Act or any number of other mechanisms they have at their disposal, they're going to be able to turn off those pipelines. The problem is all those pipelines go to the United States and then they go back into Eastern Canada where the Laurentian elites in Ottawa lies. What are they going to do? Cut off oil to their own voting base?
Well, I mean, I guess they could increase interprovincial trade and try to truck it over, which would be even a more stupid idea than this one is.
Well, the Americans have pointed this out multiple times. They've said, if you want to cut off oil, we have the ability to cut off oil just as much as you do. All your pipelines run through us, buddy.
Exactly. But also, speaking of Alberta and Danielle Smith, apparently she's not so much on board. It might be a strategy of playing good cop, bad cop. We'll see if her eyes are set on Ottawa, as we believe. But Stephen Taylor says, quote, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith comes out against retaliatory tariffs against the United States, understands the emotional rush of retaliation. Emotional being the key word there, worries about an effect on Canadian consumers.
Yeah, and I absolutely love her statement here, and I love her stance that we're not going to go into a tariff war with the United States. The problem, she doesn't hold the leverage. The federal government holds the leverage here. And as more and more provinces get on board with federalization, because Carney's going to be making bailout payments and things like that, we're going to have to see how this kind of meshes up. I think Alberta is going to be one of the last provinces they're able to break, but eventually they're going to go after them. And all they would have to do is cut off the oil to the United States, because that is ultimately the majority of the revenue Alberta has at this moment.
And magic up a way to not let people fully become independent.
Well, one more thing. This is probably the best reason for Albertans to vote for independence on October 19th. So Mark Carney can't use Alberta as leverage.
Exactly.
The retaliatory tariffs, I know emotionally it feels good to retaliate. I get that. But let's remember what happens when we retaliate. When retaliation happens, it means that everybody who is buying products from the United States are now going to face upwards of 50%, upwards to 50% tariffs. And they're talking about that being on steel, on dairy, on appliances, on agriculture equipment. That one worries me a lot. The retaliatory tariffs.
Well, now as the Canadian economy gets worse and worse, and if potentially they do use Alberta oil and natural gas as a leverage point, we can vote for independence. We have a way out. We don't have to take it. We need to send a message to Ottawa on this first referendum, because that puts the pressure on Ottawa, knowing we are willing to break free until we get to that binding referendum, saying you don't use our oil and natural gas for leverage on our number one trading partner. The future without Canada looks like a good trade deal with the United States, a good relationship with the United States, and a strong, free, and independent nation called Alberta.
Well, and what Canada wasn't able to do, and even becoming a mirror for what Canada could have been doing and becoming and making negotiations on, if it wasn't because of the potential further plans that Mark Carney has to go into full-on communism, in my opinion.
Well, and again, it's a damn shame. Danielle Smith has made it very clear. She wants direct negotiations with the Americans. She does not want to make enemies of them. She does not want to leverage oil and natural gas or turn that off in any way, shape, or form. But she's not going to have a say on it. It's Mark Carney that ultimately is going to have the say. And Mark Carney is a globalist. That's who he's putting first, not the Canadian people.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, we've played this clip quite a few times, but it is very important to understand how all of these trade negotiations F-ups came to be. CBC Watcher says, quote, "Lots here. It's a wake-up call, well worth a listen." And this is Barry Appleton, a professor specializing in international negotiations and trade, talking about this even before the news came out.
And I've played this a few times, but it's crucially important. I actually got it in a debate online today about our last episode saying, well, this isn't the case. A standstill or a snapback is just a gentleman's agreement. It's actually not written into the contract. No, it is written to the contract. I actually gave sources and references during that debate, and eventually they ended up agreeing with me. The Mexicans entered into official negotiations and put a standstill clause within the contract so they weren't subject to any threats of tariffs. The Canadians never entered into official negotiations. That's why they were subject to threats of tariffs. And that's why Canada is in the situation it is now. Mexico is also on its fourth round or going into its fourth round of negotiations.
And yet Carney said he was a master negotiator and that he would get this done as soon as he came in. And yet here we are.
The U.S. has been putting leverage on Canada to extract as much as it can. Last summer, they extracted from us too. We had to give up the digital services tax, the DST. We got nothing in return. We were supposed to have talks. We got nothing. This time, we thought, I think, that we were going to get a delay and not have to pay. Clearly, we've had to pay something. We don't know what it is. So at the end of the day, I want to get our money's worth. And then there are two things. Normally, when you get a delay or you buy anything in the trade world, you get what's called a standstill. The Mexicans have a standstill. That's an agreement from the president of the United States not to impose more tariffs. We don't have that. So we don't have a standstill, and we don't have a thing called a snapback. A snapback is if you don't trust the other side, it automatically punishes them with a penalty. Now, a lot of Canadians don't trust President Trump. So you would think the first thing that Canada would want is a snapback. So those are the things I'm looking for.
No, I don't necessarily need a snapback, but a standstill would be absolutely amazing because every single mainstream media outlet is saying, well, Trump's just going to keep tariffing us if we agree to anything. No, if you enter into official negotiations and build that mechanism in there, and we know they're willing to do it because they did it with the Mexicans, you won't be subject to any future tariff. It's a complete lie what the mainstream media has been saying. They've also been framing these negotiations as official negotiations that Canada's in, and it's not. These are non-official negotiations. That's why they're not able to build in these mechanisms.
And why that threat was even able to be put in by the U.S. administration in the first place.
Well, and I'll say one other thing. In the very beginning, before Mexico went into the official negotiations, they made a ton of concessions to get into official negotiations and to build that mechanism in.
Please don't forget to subscribe again. It really does help us out. Do it now.